Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. On this episode, I want to try something a little different. The title of this episode, as you may have seen, is To Talk About Nothing is Something, which is to say, to talk about nothing is to talk about something. Yet, what does it mean to talk about nothing? What does it mean to talk about something? And why would I want to do a podcast about talking about nothing and talking about something? Well, one of the reasons is there's so much that goes on in our conversations that really have to do with us wanting to say something, wanting to speak. And we could at times take away the words and follow the needs and the drive to speak as being something that is more musical. That is to say, we want to be an instrument in an ensemble that projects and interacts and stands out and so on. And in that process, we feel a connectedness. We feel that we are a part of something, that we are playing a role in some way. We are a part of this ensemble. And so we're saying nothing, we're saying something, and the real distinction as to it being something or being nothing has to do with a kind of secondary level of information. And if we think about needing to connect, needing to express, and needing to find validation in our experiences, of course we can say, I want to have that I said this thing about X, or I said this thing about Y heard. And we can say that knowing that these things have been heard by somebody else, they reflect them back to us, for example, this can be really helpful to us. But it doesn't necessarily mean we will actually feel ultimately heard. Consider, how many times have you shared something with somebody and you wanted to share with them, you wanted to tell them whatever it was, and for a moment you might have felt a relief or a release of some kind, a sense that now you've spoken what you wanted to speak, and you're sure that they have heard you. And yet a little time passes and you feel the need to speak again, to connect again. And here again, it's this moment where nothing has really happened, but it means so much. There is something to it. And so we then come up with a reason or come up with an idea. It's about this, it's about that. For example, maybe there's a task that needs to get done, or you feel that needs to get done. Maybe there's an idea. Somebody mentioned something, and so you have an opinion about it, and you want to share that. But before we get to the something, notice that within this first impetus, within the nothing, there is a kind of ontological experiencing of existence that has not yet articulated itself in an ontic way. So we are experiencing that quintessential moment of being compelled, this intentionality, this being compelled into the world or of the world, or a Dasein, this kind of actualized connection that is, in a sense, our experiencing of ourselves in and of the world. Now, what this means is, before we get into the to-do list, before we get into the ideologies, before we get into any of that, before we get into the somethings, there is nothing. And this nothing is experienced. Now, why does this matter? Why is this something worth having a podcast about? Well, arguably it's not worth having a podcast about, but here we are nonetheless. And so, but what is it that drew me to think about this? Well, when I look around and I hit a kind of saturation point with what's going on in the news and what's going on in conversations with different people, where the same problems are being repeated over and over again. There doesn't seem to ever be a way to look beyond what has actually happened. There seems to be a kind of repetition. Well, what this repetition does is it creates a structure. And through repeating ourselves, we create form. But why would we want to do that? We may recognize, and I think we often do recognize, that we are quote-unquote repeating ourselves. So it's not that we are oblivious to the act of repetition. To the contrary, we may even say, oh, there I go again, or I know I always talk about these things, or I'm blabbing, or whatever it is. We do acknowledge that there is this impetus to engage in some form of repetition. Now, why is it that we might be driven or compelled or impelled to do that? Well, if we think about this experience of nothing and then this experience of something, repetition in a way holds us in the realm of something. Our issue about X, our issue about Y, and so on. And what this means is we have defined, we have performed, moving back to that analogy of the musical instrument and how we want to make sounds with others, through our musical repetition, we are able to make sounds with others. We are able to be something in the midst of nothing, which is to say we are this ontic expression of an ontological experience, which is being. We are being in the world. We are being with other. We are being with self. And this extends ourselves, hence it extends our connections into the vast unknown of our experiencing of the world. What that means is we are expanding, yet we have to expand into that which we do not know, hence we are expanding into the unknown. And at the same time, we are, in this way, dying, right? We are coming to an end. There is a finite aspect to the way in which we understand ourselves. And I say aspect just to highlight that we are not this omnipotent force, or being, I should say. We are a part of something, yet there is something, an ontic expression of this ontological experience that in some way brings forth this idea of a self, this idea of an I, from this nothing. So just like the repetition I was saying earlier, that we may repeat a theme, find ourselves going round and round on certain ideas. Now, let's just look at that idea of repetition for a moment. Let's imagine the person who is repeating their pattern in their career. Let's imagine the person who's repeating their pattern in relationships. Let's imagine the person who's repeating their pattern in religious or spiritual ideology. What all of these are doing is allowing for a form of expression to that allows the person, or enables the person, I should say, to exist. And they're existing in spite of nothing. So if we go back to this idea of the self as a repetition, as a created something in the midst of nothing, then when we are talking about nothing and talking about something, we are experiencing ourselves unfolding. And this admittedly sounds bizarre to listen to me talk about this. Because it's bizarre for me to say, because it feels like I'm trying to talk about silence. It feels like I'm trying to make a sound that best conveys no sound. It feels like a paradox. It's like the saying, dancing about architecture. It kind of betrays that the nothingness that we are experiencing, or we may be experiencing in a more deliberate way, is trying to see itself, which means it becomes something, which means we're always propelled towards something. And because we are always compelled towards something, we are expressing a form of existence that repeats and performs the synonymous act of existence that when we die, the self dies, which is to say, the agent within that repeats to create, that is therefore an existent I, is no more. So, if we take a breath, if we take an in-breath and an out-breath, and we notice this contrast between what was repetitious talking, geared towards what seemed like some purpose, some point. And now we notice there is a complete contrast. And we think, if a person was to just listen to the earlier part of the podcast, a person who does not speak or know any English, and if for some reason they kept listening and they got to this point in the podcast, what do you think they would notice? What has changed? When the horizon opens, when the immediacy of repetition fades, when stillness emerges, when we relax into a state that does not try to perform reason, does not try and perform an action, that is inactive in its action, that disengages, that lets go. What I notice is there is a tectonic shift in how I think. What's interesting about this is by slowing the pace, there is a change in how I think and speak. And if we think about this notion of repetition and the pace with which one may repeat, and we think that repetition, we assume, is about the thing we are speaking about. However, what I'm suggesting here, at least in part, is the notion that the content of repetition, although it may seem to animate the repetition, may actually be the product of repetition itself. If this is the case, or if it is in part the case, then what this implies, if not wholly suggests, is that the content of our thought is actually contingent upon the pace with which we speak and the manner in which we engage in repetition. So, if we want to challenge our thoughts, if we want to shift, then can we modulate the tempo in how we speak? Can we speak a little faster? Can we ask a few more questions to keep the ball in the air? Can we start to engage in a dialectical process that has to do with the rhythm with which we speak and less to do with the content of which we speak? Meaning, we see that it is the musicality of our speaking, the timbre, the cadence, the idiom with which we make sounds that evokes a word, and that word then leads to another word, and we are then engaging in this process that is unfolding in a way we think is premeditated, but I cannot possibly know what the next word will be, considering when I sat down to do this podcast, all I sat down with was the idea of talking about nothing is something. I had nothing else. So what did I actually start with? I started with the pace and the repetition of my voice. And so, as I explore the way in which my voice sounds, the way in which I repeat phrases, the way in which I think about the rhythmic quality of the things I am saying, I then need to fill in words to make quote-unquote sense of what I am saying. However, really what I am doing is meeting the underlying rhythm, the underlying repetition of my speaking. And this is, as I said earlier, a musical act of connection that is not contingent upon what I am saying. The words are empty vessels. They are chosen for what they offer, the rhythmic quality, the repetitive quality, and as such, this moves me to a form of free speech. And free speech, or free association, allows me to step beyond the patterns and behaviors, linguistically and otherwise, to stumble into new ideas and new insights. I am, in this way, provoking a kind of uncertainty with the suspended and leap of faith necessary to take a chance and just say something, repeat something, try something, see where it goes. Open this door, open that door. Try and fumble and fumble. It's a mess. It is a beautiful mess. And from this mess comes something else that you can pick up and then throw against the wall. Like a painter, like an abstract expressionist painter, taking the paint and firing the paint against the canvas. It splats, it sprays, it does all of these uncontrollable things. And in that process, it demonstrates the physical nature of what it is to connect. And this becomes a kind of somatic way of experiencing ourselves. It becomes a way of exploring and pushing ourselves, wondering, can I keep going? Can I keep the ball in the air? It challenges the way in which we try and control and understand ourselves, the narratives, the patterns, the beliefs, the conceptions, the frameworks, the habits. All of these different things become pushed. And we find that the relationship we can have between nothing and something is a kind of dance. And in that process, we are able to explore that which is uncertainty. We don't know. We actually do not know. And so in exploring this phenomenon within ourselves that we do not know, we can then gain a semblance of this voice within ourselves that can speak and can explore, even when what it's doing is just trying to fumble from word to word, even if it's just doing it based upon the rhythmic quality of the words that are being spoken, even if it is complete gibberish. There is something, I think, truly beautiful about this process. That you can sit down and start a conversation with ourselves and go further and go further and go further and go further. And this goes back to what I was thinking about when I thought this idea of a podcast that's saying nothing is something. And this image of the way in which there's so much information being passed around is a kind of, swirling, an international swirling of information. And from that, so much is carried, so much is so irrelevant, and all of it seems absolutely essential. And so why is it that pace of talking, that pace of communication has become so dominant that we need to keep up that momentum? Because does that not lock us into a form of communication that doesn't allow us to stop? Because what would we say if we changed the space between the words? What would we say if we changed the tenor of how we spoke? What would we say if the musical quality and the musical intention of our words shifted? So if we go back to taking a breath, we breathe in, we breathe out, and all of these ideas just float away. A part of us might say, well then, what's the point of this? That seems like a pretty good question to start with. What's the point of this? Why am I doing this? What is my life? Do I believe this? This might be a way to get to a very fundamental existential question. One which courts the very idea of what it means to be authentic, which is to challenge the habitual patterns and change our relationship to these patterns by interrupting them, and in so doing, waking up. It's not that it's easy to live in a certain state of repetition that can be extraordinarily difficult. What's difficult about it, however, is the feeling that we can never stop or never get off the hamster wheel, that we can never break away from this ongoing set of things that we need to do, that we can't even take 1 minute to stop and breathe or to change and challenge the way we're communicating, that we can't even in our interpersonal relationships, whether it's, with a lover or a friend or our children, whatever it is, say, you know what? I'm just going to talk at a different tempo. I'm going to interrupt and start to break these patterns. And in so doing, step into this kind of questioning of authenticity. what do I actually feel when I break away from the pattern of how I talk to this person, the kinds of things we talk about, because the kind of tempo and the rhythm that we have when we talk, the demeanor, the tone, the timbre, all of these different things. If I shift away from that, might I find an authentic insight into my own existence that allows me to unfold into that nothingness that is this existence that is stretching out into the unknown? And might I be able to break free, which may be only for the smallest of moments, from this sense that I am actually locked into other people's repetitions. I'm actually defined by other people's repetitions. I'm actually controlled within other people's repetitions. I want to interrupt those repetitions. And that can be the smallest thing or it can be the biggest thing. But the point here is to interrupt these repetitions, to slow down, to speed up, to see what happens when we start talking faster and thinking about these ideas and exploring the ways in which we can get inside of ourselves without knowing the direction with which we may end up going, or we may decide to not go. That we may find that whatever it is we do, wherever it is we go, we have more flexibility, more complexity, and more nuance to the way in which we experience ourselves in the world. So I'll leave it there for this week. But what I will do is let things roll, slow things down again, and maybe start to think about different things in your life and ways in which you could do them just slightly differently. Something you can do slightly different for a meal. Something you can do slightly different for how you travel to visit a friend or to go to work. Maybe a different creative approach. If you tend to start with one way, try shifting to another. And maybe play around with this idea of interrupting the way in which we have these repeated patterns in our lives. Because with each interruption, we meet an aspect of ourselves that emerges. And this can be such a special experience that can be lost by the exaggerated repetitions, the voluminous repetitions in our life. So can we find the elegant repetitions that occur within the slight gestures of change, the slight gestures of opening, the slight breaks as we interrupt these patterns? So, I hope this has been a fun way to explore how just the pace with which we speak can create a way of existing. And by slowing or speeding our language and our or more than just the tempo with which we speak, we can find different aspects of our own experience. And this can lead us to really wonderful and new insights about ourselves. So, as always, you can find me at JordanO'Connor.com. Until next time, bye for now.